everyone for being here. Thank you, Vanessa Jackson, for coming back to this place where we have your wonderful exhibition on our walls. I'm very happy to inaugurate this kind of conversation with artists, because we have done talks here before a number of times, and some of you have attended previous talks. The various things we did. We did lately a conversation with a major anti-war experts, and we held lectures and courses and other things. But this is actually the first time that we're doing conversation with an artist live like this. We've done some online, remotely, over the pandemic period, of course, but this is the first opportunity we get to do it not only with a great artist and an artist that is currently exhibiting in the space, but also with a great teacher and author, so someone that I know to be very eloquent. So I'm very pleased that we're able to do that together tonight. The way we came to do this exhibition and to become friends is we met at the opening of Francis Bacon at the Royal Academy, the recent exhibition, and we were introduced by a mutual friend. And we started knowing each other. I visited the studio a number of times, you came here, and as you will come to learn, Vanessa has quite a tough, feminist 1970s background, which means she wouldn't instinctively or necessarily trust
a beautiful man from Italy.
Come on.
He's waiting for me, He did okay.
And so it took a little bit of time, but then eventually we got where we needed to get to, and I've learned incredible things. And then she had events with the Royal Academy, since she's a Royal Academician. She's part of the establishment now, and so in the Royal Academy, at her studio here, with a number of events, always very successful and very interesting. And so now I would like to take this opportunity to learn a little bit about the history, and then we will also talk about your book, Murmurations, the latest book that came out that you wrote. And I would like to start really from the beginning. So when you started coming onto the scene in London in the early 70s.
Well, yeah, I always knew I wanted to go to art school. My sister had preceded me to art school, and for a very short time I think I thought I could be an archaeologist, and I learned how to spell it. I was looking for maybe something else because I didn't necessarily want to follow my sister, but in the end it was a fait accompli, and I did. And I went to St Martin's, which is also where she went, and in those days St Martin's was in the Charing Cross Road, and it was a vital place to be. There were loads of second-hand bookshops. You were just up the road from the National Gallery, and you had Soho, which was probably the best part of it. And it was a great art school. But I came in 71 to do foundation, and I'd like to say I arrived at the same time as women's liberation arrived in London, because it was the date, which is, for those of you know, it's absolutely there. Unfortunately, the big march was in the March of that year, and I didn't actually arrive till September, so I can't really say I was on the first feminist march, but it was important. It was important. Yeah. And then I did my foundation there, and then I did my degree there as a painting student. And then I went on to the Royal College. I was very lucky. I got the postgraduate thing too. And I suppose in terms of painting, I suppose like lots of people, you're looking at all kinds of stuff before you go to art school. You're looking at, obviously you're learning how to draw, you're learning how to see the world, and so you do a lot of life drawing, which I used to do when I was at the grammar school. I did life drawing, and you do a lot of, absolutely, the real world is part of it, and your influence maybe will be, art history to a degree, but it'll probably be like Bonnard and Matisse and those things that are around you. And little by little, and quite early on, I don't know quite how it happened, but I kind of shifted into something which was more to do with the abstract. And I think it was a kind of in search of something which was slightly beyond what might then have been the kind of, perhaps the more English traditions of figuration, and I was looking outside of that.
Yes. Well,
so by the second year, of undergraduate, I was abstract. Quite interesting, isn't it? You know.
Well, your work is full of art historical references, and
Yeah.
we will see also in the book this transpires very much, and we will see what these references are. And later on, you have taught many artists that have then themselves become a point of reference for many. But when you were at school, apart from your ideal masters, Malievich and Mondrian, but who were you talking to?
Who was I talking to? Well, interestingly, what was very good about St Martin's then, there was a very good mixture between the studio teachers and also what I think was called liberal studies or cultural theory, but I think it was liberal studies. So there were people who were, you know, the art historians, and there was art theory, which was a very new thing on the page back then. So we had people talking to us about Max Raphael and Marcuse and Marx and Hegel's, you know, stuff that was pretty hardcore, heavy stuff. And equally in the studio, we had a lot of people who, as much as I got a lot from them, were actually part of what I think can be referred to as the kind of lyrical abstraction school of London. And I have to say, one woman tutor, just the one, that was Gillian Ayres, who was indomitable and extraordinary. I don't know if those of you who know her, but in fact her work is full of gesture and colour and a sort of a total kind of expression, as it were, which was actually exactly what I didn't want to do. So it was kind of interesting to have somebody who was a tour de force, but actually, and later she employed me. So in fact, we kind of had a respect, if you like, but it was very different work. The people who actually influenced me, well, one of them was John Tagg, who is the theory man, who is actually, he's a photographer. I think he's called a historiographer in photography. Long bit, and he was very important. And he was actually very important in terms of talking about feminists and Marxism. And then in the studio, Gillian Ayres' ex-husband is a man who's much less known called Henry Mundy, and he made work that you might almost think of as being very discreet, almost like systems, very beautiful, very quiet, maybe a little Agnes Martin feel to it. So that was a great pleasure. Of course, there were people like John Hoyland. I mean, we were very lucky. We were in London. We got everybody. We had John Walker. We had a whole crowd of people of the time who were names then and still could be. But perhaps one who came less regularly but was very good and significant was Patrick Heron, whose work at that time was what he called wobbly hard edge. And I quite like that term, and I kind of use it myself. I'm not wobbly hard edge, but I'm not hard edge. And I know they reproduce like hard edge, but they're not. They're very, you know, they are slightly wobbly, but he was definitely wobbly. And I like the fact that he once said to me, amongst all of this painting, which was so gestural all around us, where everybody was saying, get out of room, loosen up, don't be so tight, all that stuff. He actually once said to me that, and I've never found the quotation, but he said that Mondrian referred to gesture as being that thing that happened between two colours. Not the idea that, you know, we think of gesture as, I think on the whole, as being very Italian in that way, or, you know, brushwork and, you know, all that sort of pouring paint around. And I think I don't know how much I thought about it then, but now I just think, yeah, that was superb because it allowed you to do things that weren't perhaps what everybody else was doing at the time.
Yeah, someone, I think yesterday, very recently, asked me if you had, if you were optical.
Yeah.
If you see what I mean. And my response was that actually, in the 1960s, Bridget Riley, you would have had that type of influence. But by the time you started working, we were no longer so much in that kind of climate, which means that you of course play with perception and you look at the way colors interact and shapes and geometry, and then geometry is of course a huge part of it, but it's not optical really. It's about movement.
There are kinetic moments.
There are kinetic moments. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's
Things
kinetic, perhaps, but not so much optical,
No.
and that's a reflection.
She was important, and should have mentioned her. She wasn't teaching, she didn't teach.
Mhm.
But I think there was something a little bit odd about her, because I think by the time, I think later I regarded her much more again. But I think there was a moment, which is unfortunate for her, when she was just seen a bit more like a kind of fashion icon. Because if people remember the very early, go back into the history of her, you know, everybody was, there was, you know, there was Mary Quant as well, but there was that notion of everything being black and white and jazzy and very much influenced by her, by Bridget Riley. So I think in a funny kind of way, I don't think we took her that seriously. We should have done. And then later, I then saw her much earlier work, which is very different again. And then her much later work, and of course, yes, I highly respect her, but it wasn't at that moment. It's kind of curious.
It's interesting because several optical artists of the 60s in various countries did have literal fashion collaborations, which today we see all the time with Louis Vuitton working with major names that are very fashionable in themselves and then bringing them into literal fashion. But this was already a phenomenon back then. And I mean, Yves Saint Laurent, of course, did the famous Mondrian dress, but then there were younger artists operating at the time, Bridget Riley, but also several Spanish, Italians who did collaborate with fashion brands.
But you know, you have to remember that we were like 70s purist Marxists.
Yes, exactly. So that's the
that
was the interestingly how the art world really has this shift in 68, 69 towards the end of the 60s, and then that becomes the 70s, and the 70s are a very strange decade that is still not being understood. If you look at the market today and what historians have been looking at, you find a lot of 1950s and 60s rediscoveries, but the 1970s are difficult because they are so dense and so theoretically engaged.
Factions.
They are factions.
And it's where the conceptual. I mean, the thing about St Martin's was that it was. I mean, it literally was these splits between those people who were painters, those people in painting who were conceptual, and then there was the sculpture department, which of course was much more famous than the painting department because it was Anthony Cairo and what one called the Heavy Metal Brigade, and there was one group of
George.
Well, yeah, but they were a different group because there was one group of people in the B course who were making heavy metal sculpture, working with Cairo, Bill Tucker, big names, and then there was another course run by a man called Peter Atkins, who it was a totally conceptual course. Interestingly, Richard Deacon was on that course. So there's this funny bit of crossover. But the Gilbert George and all of that lot, the conceptual lot, were on the other course. There was a lot going on, and there was a sort of slight dismissal that if you were just painting, you weren't very bright. You're just as if you weren't conceptual.
Right.
And I think I'm not. Postmodernism comes along in the sort of later in the 80s. As much as it was a very tricky thing for a lot of us to kind of grapple with, it was a blessing because it began to say, no, we're all artists. We just happen to use different medium, have come at it from a different angle. But there wasn't. I think at that point there was, and I guess it's Gerhard Richter, actually, who made us all allowed all of us to be conceptual, not necessarily a big C, but a small c. That you think you're not just tossing on colour and finding a nice shape. That there's a thinking process, and so that happened later, and I think you have to thank postmodernism for it.
Yeah. So what drew you? Because one concept that we will keep coming back to is the one of geometry. And what drew you to that? Because the interesting thing is, of course, here you can see the latest production. This is a new exhibition of new works, so they're all from 2020 to 2022 that you would have seen before, but actually there is a very strong coherence and cohesion in the work of Vanessa from the 70s onwards, which means
there's a kind of biomorphic world that
there is a bit of biomorphic
that's why I was getting a lot of sex.
Trend at some point. But apart from that, you have a very coherent language and a very sort of set, although variable, canon. So I wonder what's the.
That's why it's interesting when I think how quickly I became, as it were, abstract. But I think it's fun. I think it actually does have roots because I can look at sort of earlier things. I had a strange period when I'm still at school.
Yeah, heavy metal.
When I'm but I had this period when I used to kind of, for some some reason draw. I was always drawing kind of patterns, mandala, that kind of thing. A lot of that weirdly, but that I didn't think had anything to do with it. I think I dropped that. But I think it's architecture in the end. I think it's always architecture.
Yeah.
I think I was very keen on architecture when I was at school and history time. I looked at architecture a lot. I've got drawings of buildings from then, and I don't think I made the knowledge of the connection as clearly.
Yeah.
But I think that's partly that. But I think, I also think that when you start to, the nice thing about art school is you have a freedom to go into different territories. You like different artists. You discuss. Your best friend loves Bonnard. Your other best friend is in love with, I don't know, Carl Andre or something. It could be completely like that. And I think you sort of begin to find yourself. But I think at the same time there was and there is a sort of canon. And I think in the middle of all that is Cubism. And we've now got the Cézanne show on, which is probably the beginning of all of it. But Cubism's there, and I think it was constantly referred to in some way or another, because it was the moment of where things really did have a shift.
Yeah.
And I think that's what probably really drew me.
Yeah.
And then from Cubism, you then look at the antecedents and the connections and the interrelationships between, obviously you look at Picasso, Braque, Gris, you look at the centerpiece, but then I think you realise that the things that were happening slightly that way or slightly that way, let's say Malevich, let's say Mondrian, you begin to do that, you begin to look back and forth. And the nice thing about art history is that it isn't linear. You can have this and have that. And I can remember many years later, because I'd completely fallen in love with the Russian constructivists. And of course also, what buoyed me up there was that there are lots of women. I mean, a lot of Malevich's students, and not just students, but you have Popova, who's my number one, Stepanova, Exter, Rozanova, whole bunch of women who were doing amazing things, not just in painting, but in photography, in theatre design, in film. There was like a fantastic, that was amazing. And then many moons later, got to go to Russia back in the old Soviet days, and then you sort of get that icon connection. It's like it's wonderful. So it's Rublev, and it's, anyway. Yeah.
So you see why this is something.
I do ramble on.
No,
yeah.
I love the fact that today we can have a conversation with someone who can pick up on so many art historical references and can enrich the conversation to this level, because, and then you will tell us more about this and your experience as a teacher and part of the academic communities in London, but this is something that we have been losing.
Oh, yeah.
In today's, one of the reasons why we do these things here is that, and I did say this last time we inaugurated this kind of format, is that it is very difficult today, with the galleries being mostly, well, the auction houses doing their job, which is simply to sell things. The galleries essentially keeping up with that and having more and more time dedicated to having to go to art fairs all over the world and keeping all these huge spaces in multiple cities running, etc., etc. And it leaves less and less and less and less space for this kind of, let alone factions, as you were saying before, or defending one's idea and really, bringing about criticism of works that are that need to be criticized, or works that need to be praised, but in an intelligent way and in a way that really reads into the works. None of that, but we don't even have anymore. We don't even have the time to actually look at what a painting or a sculpture today connects to in the context of the broader history. So the reason why I love this little book, which is called Murmurations, and it's new, and Vanessa just presented it at the Royal Academy a few weeks ago, is that in these little chapters that are mostly one page each, you really have a wealth of cross-cultural references that go from archaeology to politics to more abstract ideas, mostly looking at things such as geometry and time, and also there are some sort of diary-like parts about your travels, but always connecting, travels to Egypt, looking at antiquity, travels to Italy, looking at architecture and geometry and harmony of the Renaissance or Baroque architecture. So it's such a really light but dense at the same time kind of reading. And I wanted to, you spoke about the wobbly art edge, and also an interesting element that I think makes these paintings so dynamic and so kinetic in a way, because they have an architectural presence, but they also are, that there is movement in them. So there's very much, you can see there is a lot of dialogue with Russian suprematism, but also it's very well said here about curving in space, about the curve, because of course one thing that makes them move is this tension between the straight line and the curved line. And here you say, this curving sets up a world of intricate fascination to counteract the norms of life and modernism and the strictest sometimes applied by geometry. In the studio, the arc of art history twists like a Möbius strip from the Baroque to Byzantium constructivism to the catacombs. So you can see we go back 2,000 years, and then we come to the early modernism and back here again. Paradoxically, the curve may be ephemeral, merely a line drawn in the sand or built of opaque constructed concrete, perceived as interwoven stillness. Art history is never linear. I travel in art history. So this is extremely fascinating, and it's not something that, unless you really look into them, you would not necessarily see it prima facie looking at her paintings. But then the reason why they grow on you, the more you look at them and the more you live with them, as we have done in the past couple of months, really they open up an entire world of perception and knowledge behind them. So this is really, really fantastic. And one thing I would like to do at this point also about the book. So the book is called Murmurations, which is, of course, what birds do.
Mostly starlings, but it is.
Starlings,
they
do these fantastic figures. And I sent out a few invites to this evening, and an older friend sent me this beautiful response. He couldn't make it because it's his birthday today. And I went to supper at his, and a few nights ago, and I had no idea that he actually had two works by Vanessa Jackson that I wasn't aware of, and they don't know each other. And he had two little works, and I just saw them there, and I'm like, how did you get this? And he's like, oh, I got them decades ago, and I don't know in which way, but and he sent me the most beautiful message, which is actually very interesting about the title of the book. And he said, as you know, I am in complete awe of Vanessa Jackson's work, but sadly it is my birthday tomorrow. At a certain age they come too quickly. And so I am afraid I will not be able to attend. Should you be able to purchase Murmurations, and even more special to get Vanessa to sign a copy, I would of course be in your debt. Murmurations, as you know, as a birder, are very special. We've discussed birds before. As a child, being schooled in a barbaric institution in Seaford, when I was not being beaten for some minor offense, in the autumn I would escape to the South Downs to watch the clouds of starlings create beautiful and constantly changing structures before they would suddenly at Dempsey collapse into a roost. Then, sensibly, they would migrate, crossing the channel for warmer climes. You would have seen them in Rome. Stunning. And then he says, I hope at some point to get one of the pictures. Every day, the ones I have give me so much pleasure and an inspiration. So, I mean,
no, that's kind of like, ooh,
yes,
you know,
I know. I was also moved.
We have to give him one.
And, yes, indeed. And so this is the kind of experience that some people that have known the work even longer than I have, I mean, which is easy because we've only met a year ago, so really can feel by staying.
And it's interesting because using that title, because there was a a working title, because it actually, there's an original lecture that took place time ago, which is what this came out of, and that was called Curvature and Common Sense. Complicated, but curvature, but that was just one chapter. Murmurations was one chapter in this little book, and the publishers liked this one. They wanted just one word,
Yeah.
But what's also funny about that is that it's the most amazing shape that you've all seen at some point, and I use it in the book as the sort of the one thing that painters really can't paint. It's a thing that is like the intangible. I mean, we know painters paint clouds. We know they paint sea. We know they paint other things that move. But somehow there's something a bit more. It could be there for a few seconds longer to catch, and But you don't see paintings of murmurations. You see films occasionally, but that's it. It's like that's what's quite funny to give the title of the book to the thing you can't.
That's
actually,
true. Yeah, and it is towards the end of the book.
It is quite
actually.
late on.
That.
But if I go back to that thing that's to do with wanting art history, I mean, there was a very beautiful quote that somebody used at the book launch for this, and it's by Philip Guston, but it's that quote about being in the studio, and there are people in the studio, in your studio, there are other artists, this is obviously in your head, there are other artists, there are critics, there are just people, and bit by bit, the critic leaves, bit by bit the other artists leave, bit by bit the art historian leaves, and then you're on your own in the studio. And then if it's going really, really well, you leave. Which I think is a beautiful point, because the point about my world of art is that it's not about me. That's partly why I'm not an expressionist, touchy person. It's about the thing that you can put into the world, but you've been given it. And the whole thing about using geometry is that it is in, as I pointed out, but thank you. It's in everything. I mean, it's in everything out there in the world. You can't. If you use the word universal, you can get into dodgy worlds. But culturally, it doesn't belong to anybody. Culturally, it exists in every culture. It also exists in a table and a chair and on the floor and this wall. So it's got its own. It lives. It doesn't. It's not yours. And therefore, you can use it. And I do refer to using it as a form of democracy, because I don't. It's an open field. It's not mine. I don't own it. It also frees you up from the gross problem, which is what I think you're also referring to in the art world, which is also this notion of the kind of individual artist identity, which often is in front of the work. I mean, I don't mind doing this because I have learned to love him, but it's not the thing I would. This isn't. It's this, not me. And as we know, the art world, and we have to thank Andy Warhol and lots of really interesting people, and probably Michelangelo, but. Very often the artist is in front of the work as opposed to the work itself. And that whole notion of identity being so much more important. No. If I just steal, I'm happy to have other people's, I'll take. And that's what it's there for. And then I can hopefully find a place for it to go within this mad democratic world of geometry. And yes, I can't pretend it's not me. I mean, I know that I would choose these colours, I paint in this kind of particular way, but it's less important than sort of me, my gesture, here I am, which I think like everything, like whether you're a writer or a composer or whatever, there's so much emphasis put on the person, what they look like, how they play the violin with their hair flowing, no, it's the violin, so that's.
And this is very much, and there is a reason why I'd asked to come forward. It's now there are people coming at the back. Right. Anyway. Yeah. This is very much an approach that was taken in the 1960s, late 50s sometimes, but then it flourished in the 60s, where people started working in groups also.
Yeah.
So it was less about the individual, it was less about me, as you're saying. It was definitely not about expression, but it was about a research, about vision. Yeah. So these were all coming from the Bauhaus, and the Bauhaus was still running in certain respects, and we looked at artists that saw their practice as a kind of scientific endeavor. So when today you look at a vaccine or any scientific discovery, there is never one name. Even today, less and less you get Nobel Prizes assigned to one person. They always have multiple names because multiple people sign papers or make discoveries or get patents assigned to them. Sometimes it's hundreds of people. It's like entire research groups that are maybe very large. So at the time is when we started seeing the flourishing of groups of 3, 4, 5, 8 artists sometimes working under a name, putting out their work, and you couldn't tell who was the. Then obviously there is still an element of individualism, and also the market appreciates the individual. So then they all also started having their own names and their own signature and their own practice that it got distinct from the group and then distinct from the others. But it was very much a type of idea that got developed in those years and flourished in those years. And so it's no surprise that in the 70s, although certain conceptual and behavioral practices were heavily individualized, and also they started working on the body very much, so it doesn't get much more personal and expressionist than that, in a sense. But then there were still a strand of artists that thought, okay, we need to do a work that is objective, in a sense, and works on certain structures that we can investigate and we can research. And so this is very much an expression of this. And it's fascinating to see it in a light that is different than the cold geometrical fashion of the 1960s, but it comes closer to us and is warmer, and it's not just about science and numbers, but it's just as much about history. So this is something that I also
it also connects with that thing which, I mean, I haven't had so many opportunities, but I've done wall paintings, and I had the pedestrian crossings in Piccadilly last year, which some of you may have seen around Piccadilly, and that was probably like, finally I've done some public art in the public sphere. You know, not much money, but fantastic. You know, but the wall paintings were also that thing, which is, I mean, and you know, Solar Wit is in my studio almost every day, and he's so close, I have to tell him to fuck off. You know, he's dead. but I mean, actually, it's almost like I start to make a drawing, I start to make some work, and it's like, and then I have to adulterate it, because, you know, that's the only way I can get beyond him. But I mean, you know, and of course he's the preeminent wall painter, you know, and you know, after your frescoes, I'm not, you know, contemporaneous.
In the contemporary world, and he loved Italy, as you know.
He lived in Italy. But it is that sort of, you know, it is that thing about wanting to take it, you know, I don't think I'm a natural collaborative artist, but I do not, and I am, and it is the tricky thing about the solitariness of being an artist. You do need to be in your own space, you do need to close the door, you do need to just focus. So it is a tricky one, but on the other hand, you must have that relationship with other artists, that you know you're sharing stuff, that you're not this kind of genius thing.
And it's interesting, you brought up, this is something that I was going to ask you about in any event, which is this wall painting element. You have done that kind of work, which, I mean, these paintings, as you can see, are architectural, and they do expand into the space, but Vanessa has literally taken over the space by painting on the walls on occasions, and of course there is a tradition of that in contemporary art and contemporary geometric abstraction, Solar Wit, David Tremlett, and other artists. But and I would like to know how you feel differently and work differently when you're approaching actually a canvas that you know is going to go into a space and is creating a space of its own, and when you instead are going directly onto the architecture.
It's a very different sort of, I'm going to say, it's the beginnings of working on a wall, you do need to kind of obviously work out some kind of maquette. You need to have a lot more planning in a way, and then the actual doing of it is just a sort of labour of getting up and down scaffolding, and I'm not very good at heights. But it's what is interesting is that when you really get into the wall painting, it's almost easier when you're doing it, because you can just fly, because the construction of the architecture is the container, And so you can go up, you can go down, you can move around it. You can use it as a kind of a actual movable thing. And I did one in Sadler's Wells, which you probably know is great, very high, it's 10 metres tall and it's about 10 metres wide, and 3 lots of scaffolding. And it had sort of little bits, I have to say, almost trompe-l'oeil, just moments, nearly, which was quite exciting.
Which part of Sadler's? On the stair?
It's behind, when you go in and you go up to the first floor, you then see this huge wall that goes up at the back.
Oh.
And they used to have somebody, Sasha Craddock used to be the curator of it. They had shows that turned over. They don't have the money anymore, so it doesn't matter. But it was extraordinary to do it. And it had a right angle, so that's the bit at the corner was where it kind of could do really amazing things. And then I did another much even bigger, really, although not so tall, which was in the Cafe Gallery in Southwark Park, which is a beautiful gallery that people don't get to because it's Southwark Park, but it's it's bigger than the Serpentine, it's massive. And that was all the way round, so it's almost like being inside your own head, quite scary. But once you get into the process of doing it, it's really it becomes it becomes quite magical. You're literally moving around with it, and it's jazz, it's like it's moving. And what makes it difficult, you come back to the studio, and the much more difficult thing is that thing which is the stretcher, which is the container.
And it's the white page.
And it's a very old-fashioned thing to talk about. It's very 70s to say the edge. What do you do with the edge? What happens when you get to the edge? And the container. And it actually, whenever I've done them, it's taken me quite a long time to get back into the studio to, how does this work? Because it's this thing. It's a container. And it's much more difficult. So in the end, I like deviating. It's good to do it. And I do prints and other things too. It's good to go out of the studio. It's good to go elsewhere. And good to think differently. But the most difficult thing is actually being back in the studio with the thing you know most about, but actually, yet again, how much space, the positive, the negative, all of this is full of all that, as you can see. What do you do? How much do you fill it up? How much do you keep it moving open, empty? And I probably should say, which is kind of obvious, but I make bigger paintings than these. Couldn't get them up the stairs. I'm still talking about it because it's all your fault. But the point about it is that the biggest paintings are actually to my scale. I'm not very tall. And many years ago, there's a very marvellous man who taught Islamic art. Actually, he's not from there, but he was really well versed, and he taught at school. And he was Keith Critchlow. And he once said to me, he saw me painting 7-foot square paintings when I was a student at the Royal College. And he said to me, that's perfect proportion, 7 foot, for people who don't do feet anymore, it's an old fashioned thing. It's like 2 metres and about a third, just under.
2/3.
But it's an old, but it's actually it's the Vesuvian man. He's 6 foot.
Oh, the Vitruvian.
Sorry.
Yeah.
It's about 2 metres.
Yeah, but the Vitruvian man is 6 foot, 6 foot, 6 foot, and 1 foot of spirit. All around him. And so Keith Critchlow came up with this, wonderful to do 7-foot square paintings. He thought, I'd got it, I understood the whole, the golden section, there's all sorts of things connected with it. To which I, in my churlish way, because you know how polite I am, in my churlish way, I said to him, yeah, but I'm a 5'3" feminist, what can I do with that? I actually, of course, apologised, and he's wonderful, and we then went on to talk a lot more about that form of, Islamic geometry in that world, which is also, I'm also fascinated with, but you have to be careful, which is why I said you can't say, I don't think you should ever use the word sort of, as if you own things, because I don't, I'm only an onlooker, so I have to,
Well, you also speak about ornamentation and that history,
and that does come from
quoting Alois Riegel.
And
this is a gold, but you have no idea. And also, can I just stress once again, the more I hear Vanessa speak, I have been to hundreds of artist talks, have done a few myself, and it's so rare. You would think that these artists that you see, these figures that you see in major museums, that certain years they get 5 museum shows across a single country, in major galleries representing them and huge auction results, etc., etc. And then you hear them speak, and suddenly you lose all interest in the work, because you understand that it's literally like almost by chance that they found a little device, visual device, and suddenly that worked for them. And then
or they had other people writing for them.
And then they had other people
and
writing
that's
for them.
the classic American, isn't it? The American artists that, and I haven't mentioned the people who were also important to me, the minimalists.
Well, we'll go on to America in a moment. Yeah.
But I mean, you think about the people who have, all the October people, but also Rosalind Krauss, or I don't know, all the big names in America, who've actually, I mean, I'm a big fan of Bryce Marden's, and I think if you look at his early work, which was the Impasto.
But if you look at the more works of yours.
Both sides, but that early stuff, which is Impasto and very simple blocks, very influenced by Italian, by Piero Francesco, all these things. And I always thought he was a genius in terms of writing, because I was always reading stuff about him. And he's not an idiot, but the man who writes about him is a man called John Young, who's a poet. And that's the funny thing, you suddenly realise, oh, that's where I'm getting all the stuff about Bryce Marden from. Yeah. And I'm not saying he's not, I think he's perfectly right, but actually the person who writes about him is the stuff that feeds it.
No, and it's interesting. So the next chapter that I wanted to touch upon briefly is your experience in the United States, because there is a very interesting thing that actually I'm not sure I had thought about before, but the fact that minimalism, of course, as a movement, is preeminently American, and Sol LeWitt, we already mentioned, is the founding father, one of the founding fathers of it, as well as conceptual art. And you point out the fact that this idea of the grid, of course, would flourish in New York, which is a city that is a grid in itself. So the fact that, of course, we start with Mondrian, and it's a European tradition, but when it's exported there, and then it gets on this massive scale of size, but also simplification and accessibility to a larger public, and it's less about transcendence and religion, which Mondrian was about in part, and his colleagues, and it gets more about muscular expression in many ways. But of course it would happen in a city that is a grid in itself. And is that, so what was your, Vanessa went to New York at some point, she spent some time there.
As soon as I could get there.
Yeah.
For those of you who don't know, there was a man called Laker who suddenly made flying there possible financially, just. Yeah. And I won a small scholarship when I left the Royal College. John Minton, who was a very famous British artist, left an endowment, and I got something like 180 quid in 1978. And nobody was going to check out what you did with it. It's like, here you go. It was a travel grant, but I had a big dilemma. It was either buy a small motorbike, a 125, and a leather jacket, or go to New York, because New York was calling. And this Freddie Laker made it possible by these rather frightening small planes, which meant we could get there. We could afford to get there. And I'm really glad I did that. I did get the leather jacket later.
So how did that
It was amazing. It was amazing. It was completely, it was that thing where I think everybody has the same thing. The first time you go to New York, it's like you're in the movies. You just know you're walking down Broadway, Grand Central Station, everything's just like the movies. But it was completely that thing about kind of being able to see the work that we had some very good shows here. We'd had Rothko, we'd had some good shows here. But to actually go to the Modern and the Met and all these places, actually, and all the, at that time, all the Soho galleries, and see Bryce Marden, and see Elizabeth Murray, who comes up a lot in there, and see the art of the people that you'd only been able to see in things like Art Forum, because we didn't have internet. So it was fantastic. Plus, I kind of thought, I should be here. There was a sense in which abstract painting in America has never been a question. I mean, not since, I don't know, 50-something. Yeah. Whereas I know that when I have if I have a typically English person into my studio, one of the first questions they will say is, what are they about? And you kind of go, whereas it's just there's a kind of understanding that this work does exist. And as I used to go back and forth as much as I could, and I loved it. And I had a bit of success. I was in a I was in a show in the drawing room, and
Great place.
and I even won highly illegally, I won a National Endowment Award, and I had to pretend I lived there. So my best friend became my agent for about 3 months while she had it in her bank account. It was a small sum, and it wasn't that illegal, but it was very nice to be like, oh, you know, oh, they
It's
get it.
prescribed
They
by
get it.
now. It's
They get
okay.
it.
They're not going to
Yeah, it's a long
catch
time now.
you.
The IRS is still lovely. But the extraordinary thing about that, and as I kept going, and then of course there was a period in the mid '80s which was called Neo Geo,
Yes.
and there were a lot of artists at that period where some of them who'd been doing it for quite a while, like David Diao and older ones, and then younger ones. And I guess in a way, if somebody who's exactly the same age as me is Peter Harry,
Yeah.
and I'm a fan.
Right.
And we have a conversation about every 5 years where he vaguely remembers me and I go, love your work, it's fine. He writes really well as well.
Right.
I like his writing. But there was something going on in the sort of 80s, and I was very, very tempted to stay.
I remember, yeah, you mentioned this.
But
that you
I
were
mean,
torn
I
between-
didn't really want to have to hag it on, being a waitress again and not having a green card and all that stuff. And I did have a love life here and a mum and a sister and things like that.
And this is interesting because then you can tell us a little bit about what you witnessed being in London and in the middle of it, because you were in the schools when the YBAs came about.
I wasn't in the schools then. When the YBAs came around. I was teaching. I was head of painting at Winchester.
Right.
I had to teach a lot because I had made a commitment with my husband that we really wanted to live and work in the same place, which you can imagine in London was like, whoa, 2 people wanting studios and live there. And we found a wreck of a building in a very trendy area now called Bermondsey Street, which you all know from restaurants and things. And
the White Cube, which is just opposite Vanessa
But
Street.
thankfully, there was a moment in the mid 80s when you could pick up a derelict building, basically. We then became builders. I'm very, very good at, I can do lots of things that I never want to do again. But like bricklaying and filling skips and great stuff, putting ceilings down and putting ceilings up. And, but the whole point about that was, and it did curtail a bit of the old travel, but it was the thing about being able to live and work in the same place, which I still do. At that point, I was doing a lot of teaching. I was head of painting at Winchester and had to be proper job to do it. Didn't do Sunday lunch. Weekends were art. Didn't matter. We did get holidays, thank God. The YBAs came along, of which I think we should have been grateful because it kick-started a different way of looking at London. The galleries things were happening. People we hate, like Saatchi, did do something. We can't, we're kind of caught between rock and a hard place on those things. And we wish there were more Saatchis at the time. Just having one was a bit annoying, but they broke open something.
Yeah.
Because when in 1978, a woman who worked for Time Out called Sarah something, it's gone now, but she itemised that there were only, would you believe, 17 commercial galleries in London.
Incredible.
So you have to thank that thing that exploded.
Yeah.
And it was absolutely what London needed, and it made London, put it back into much more international world pool. Of course, having said that, I actually had a conversation with Gary Hume about a couple of hours ago. He was one of those.
Great.
And we were laughing about it because he was surprised I didn't have a gallery. I told him what I was doing. And I said, yeah, well, Gary, I said, you lot. They're nice people, some of them. But of course, the YBAs literally pushed my generation because suddenly it was about being young. We were told when we were students to go away until you're 40 and then people take you seriously. But of course the YBAs blew that one out of the, and so now it would be much more likely to be, and ever since then, to be, you're going to come out, when you come into the world of an artist, you can really ought to be about 28. That would be the time.
Yeah.
It's tricky to be older.
And because you have seen hundreds.
I was teaching them.
Yeah, exactly. You were teaching them. Some of them definitely I know about the YBA lot, but also the subsequent generations that then became almost.
I wasn't teaching the YBA lot because they were just that little bit
at least
younger. But I suppose I did because Chris O'Feely became attached to the YBAs. He wasn't the original YBA.
Okay.
He was he had me as a tutor for a short while. and I wound him up. He was very tough. Don't blame him. You know, he saw another middle class white woman coming towards him, going, oh, here we go, more of that sort of art school stuff. And I thought, how am I going to get through? And I got through by asking him when he was going to grow up and stop being Basquiat. He got very cross, and then he kept putting more paintings out of the back room, you know, because he'd only showed me one because he couldn't be bothered to begin with. And then we bonded just by him being cross and me being bullshit, you know. It's fine, and he's lovely, you know. Yeah. So there are a few of the people who kind of who were the sort of very last bit of the YBA. Yeah. He was in Centations, of course.
And how have you seen the landscape of our artists see themselves and behave, etc., as even at student level or master's level, RA schools level, in terms of this expression of, you know, of being more about the expression and about themselves or not? Like what has been?
It's very. I think it's so varied. I mean, okay, so I mean, I taught for longer at the Royal College before the Royal Academy, and that was in painting, and then I taught him with the PhD students as well. And I think I'm just thinking how that works. I mean, it's tricky. It's harder because, it's got harder because people are financially, it's much more difficult. They don't have as much time to cook, to dwell, to make mistakes, to lose themselves. When I would have had long days and, you know, long time, I always worked at holidays, but I didn't have to work every week, 3 times a week to pay the rent.
Also, you didn't have to look at your phone all the time.
No,
you could actually work. You know,
that's
which is massive.
But it is more complicated now. Yeah. But then also because of, and this is the plus and the minus, but because it's not just the YBAs, it happened all over the world. Because let's go back to the horror of the gallery, is that the galleries want people that they feel that they can launch young. So I would say this, and I've said it in front of people. Probably my glorious career hasn't lifted off at times because I've been outspoken. I've said in front of galleries and people at sort of talks and platform discussion things that if they use postgraduate courses as the cheapest art fair that they can go to, it doesn't cost them what it costs to go to Basel or Miami. They get a free glass of wine and they can pick up a young artist there and then and put them into a show, let's say White Cube, or maybe not as big as that, but somewhere else, in the autumn of that year. And that student probably is up and running and ready for that at that point, and they're really pleased, and they've got, I made it, I've got it, fantastic, and we all go, great. But that gallery will then demand something from them the following year. And not just one thing, but maybe this, and this, and this, and this, and this. And then 3 years later, they talk to you, because they know you knew them when they were students, and they say, I'm really worried about blah, blah. I think he's cracking up. I think she's cracking up. I don't think they've got the kind of, and you're going, whoa, because the pressure is so heavy.
Yeah.
And it's the demand of that. And this thing about always wanting the young and the young and the young, and then putting on. And then there'll be some that manage that, who are tough enough, who sustain it, and talented enough. They're probably all talented enough, but some of them crack, and you never hear about them again. Or when you do, you find that they've just been spending the last 5 years being a Damien Hirst dot painter. You know, and it's tough. It's very tough. You've got to be very, you know, the people like Michael Armitage, who was another ex-student, or Eddie Peake, YQ, thankfully were a little bit older. Both of them. They were like in their 30s before it got them. And thankfully, very talented, very different, but actually able to kind of be grounded enough to hold it. But they're not, I mean, if you talk to Phila de Barlow, who is 10 years older than me, when she got sort of launched, I mean, she was quite successful. She was teaching like I did up to the age, she went on to 65 at the Slade. And then everything launched completely, you know, Hausenberg, Royal Academy, everything. She did have other shows before, more than I do, but it was massive. And if you talk to her about the kind of ordeal of suddenly being, you know, a museum show in Australia, whilst you got to show in Vienna and you got a show on in New York. I mean, it's, you know, it's daunting. But she laughs about it because it happened to her when she was 65.
Yeah, so you're
different,
you're prepared, you're more prepared.
Ready, yeah.
Well, I think we have had about so many different things and such a breadth of things that what I would like to do is maybe open up the floor, because here we have some great specialists, we have artists, art historians, some of them who would have really enjoyed, you know, discovering some more remote recesses of your work and your history, and they would have picked up on all the references, but maybe others who are looking at certain things for the first time. So perhaps we should get some questions and see if there is any particular aspect of what we have discussed, or maybe that we haven't discussed, that you would like to hear about. I also apologize, I don't know what's going on. Normally it is very quiet. They have decided to do some sort of... Oh, it's the football, they must have won. What can we do? So anyway, hopefully they will stop
Is
soon.
it England? Is it England won?
It's in Morocco and Spain.
Okay.
I thought it was people trying to get in here.
Maybe. Yeah. So please do ask if you have anything that you would like to hear from Vanessa.
Well, I'll start off with a quite general question, which is what inspires you to with your art? Where do you get your ambition to do your paintings?
Just getting up in the morning.
Okay.
That's like asking a lifetime's. I mean, if I didn't do it, but the other way around, I would be a morose. I don't know. I'd be chewed up, horrible person. It's the thing that keeps you sane. I mean, the studio. It's this weird thing. You know, we have a social life, we have a private life. You know, but the studio is the place of the greatest sanity. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, who were the artists who have inspired you the most when you were just beginning the career? Because you've mentioned that you looked at Warhol a lot, but at the same time you have managed to develop your own style.
Well, Warhol, I wasn't probably looking. I mean, Warhol was just a very significant figure. He wasn't somebody that particularly spoke to my work, as it were. Not then.
It is very different.
So the people that I talked about the Russian constructivists, the Cubists, the Russian, but the people who were Elizabeth Murray, a New York painter. I looked at a lot of Agnes Martin, Solowit. I probably meant. Gosh, I mean, the other thing about it is that I did go to Italy a lot, and I looked at, you know, one of my, you know, I suppose the thing that you do, one of the things you do in Italy, which is very like the Goethe, you start at the top, you do Florence, you do Siena, you do that early, which is wonderful, and you fall in love with Giotto and Fra Angelico and all of the things like that. And then as you get older, you can handle Caravaggio. It takes a while, and then you get to the Baroque and the Roman.
You get to Rome.
But early, I used to go to Italy when I was backpacking and all that stuff, and that was incredibly important. And it's very difficult to realise that that sort of finding the way to San Sepolcro was like a nightmare if you were backpacking, hitching or whatever. You know, looking for Piero Francesco or whatever. I don't think I should forget that is really there too. I mean, I don't think it necessarily shows, but it's that kind of the beautiful construction, the fantastic. I'm a big, you know, it's not just geometry, it's composition. Really old-fashioned word, very difficult word to use in art school.
I imagine, and also Piero da Francesca. It is a poignant point of reference because it was a lot about geometry, and he was a mathematician.
Absolutely.
And someone who said, and you can see it in the paintings, and it's at this point quite a known thing, but he was an important point of reference for Burri.
Oh, yeah.
So the whole latest production, even earlier on, but particularly for the Cellotex series, which starts in 1980 and goes until his death in 1995, is very geometrical, and it has really direct references to some of Piero da Francesca's paintings, which were of course also nearby in Umbria and Tuscany, like at the border where he was operating. So it also made sense because there was this like visceral, sort of like really physical connection there. But with you too, I mean, you can see like the curved shape and
the Madonna, you know.
That's the
all
one.
of those,
That's
you know.
the one.
No, but I mean, a lot of people, and I think probably that answering your question, it's almost like you forget people. I mean, I know that when I did this book, I suddenly realised there were people I hadn't mentioned, thinking, whoa, but because they're, you know, I'd forgotten that I looked at them a lot at one point, and then I kind of, you sort of move on, and look at more other people, and then the greatest thing, like discovering the Baroque when you're in my 40s rather than in my 20s, when I knew it was there, but it wasn't.
Yeah,
That is fantastic, and we go on doing it, which is, you know, like that's what's so great about the arts. You're not sort of, you know, stuck somewhere. You know, you can always kind of go on adding and rediscover.
and even reading, you find things, and it's like and you keep mentioning names, and you're like, yeah, but she's really talking about Agnes Martin here. And then in the end, you find like, and then of course there is Agnes Martin. And I'm like, okay, yes, this is what I was waiting for.
Sonia Delorny I met, which is in the book.
Yeah.
And she was deeply significant. I was railing against the Royal College as a student because there were no female tutors at all, and I went to complain to the professor because I was the mouthy one that, you know, got the kind of group together to sign the petition and put the names down that they wanted of all the different people that we'd like to invite in. And he was an amazing man, Peter Tomassoni. He was an amazing, highly intellectual Marxist, wonderful man. But he wasn't very sympathetic to either the abstract or to the idea that there was anything, why would you need to talk to a woman, you know, which was fascinating. I did have a wonderful tutor called John Golding, who was a man who taught both at the Courtauld. Some people would know him. He wrote probably the best book about Cubism, and he was my tutor for my first year at the Royal College, or my second year at the Royal College. It was a 3-year course, you always had to change your tutors, and I asked specifically to have him again for the 3rd year, and this Professor de Francia said, well, you can't have the same tutor twice, you know. And I said, just I want him. Why? And rather than me saying because he's a brilliant man and a great intellectual, blah blah blah, I said because there's no chemistry, because John was gay. And it was just, he didn't get that. You know, well, he did eventually, but it's like, don't you get it? You're surrounded by, you know, things haven't changed a lot. Some very nice male tutors and some others that would goose you in the lift, you know. So it was like, you know, give me a break. Let's have a, you know, can we have some women? So I go along, late in the evening, Francia was an absolutely full-on, always there worker. And I think he had a thyroid problem because he was really vile in the morning, so we used to wait till later in the day. And I went along with the petition, everybody else was like out in the corridor, they didn't come in. And he went through this list, which did have people like Gillian Ayres and Bridget Riley, but it also had, you know, Griselda Pollock, who was and Germaine Greer, so all sorts of things that would really upset him anyway. But we had all these names, and he went through with a big felt tip pen, going, "Won't have her in the building. Don't know, no." And it's like really rude. And I'm sitting there going, "Oh, hasn't worked." And then he said, "Who do you really want?" And there was a poster on his wall of a Sonia Delorny show, and I just went, "Her." I mean, you know, she was a very old woman, still alive, but I have no way she's going to visit the Royal College. And he did something that, you know, this is where, you know, all your politics should be, you know, I should have been put up against the wall and shot. Because he then went, "Here's £50, I'll write to her," because he knew her, and he was half French or Belgian, but he could I'll write to her and ask her if you can come and visit. I then had to leave with my 50 quid in my hand, and the list which had been scored through, and go and talk to my colleagues, and tell them that I had been bought off. Like any politician will ever know. You know, they gave me money, I took the money. Anyway, the point was I did go meet her.
But you got her, so that was amazing.
She was amazing. She was truly amazing. She unfortunately wanted to talk to me consistently all the time about Robert. And if you looked at books back in those days, which is how we got information, when you saw Delorny, it was always Robert. When you saw Arp, it was always, what's his name?
Jean.
Oh, right. Yeah. When you saw Albers, it was always
Joseph.
So, you know, now we have had the wonderment of knowing that we can talk equally about these people, but we really didn't. I mean, I knew Arp, Tabi Arp, as somebody who made copies.
Right. Yeah.
You know, Albers, what did she do? I don't know. You know, we didn't even know about her.
Histories, yes.
No, we knew nothing about her back in the, you know, we did know a little bit about Sonia Delorny. Unfortunately, she did spend an awful lot of time defending her husband and wanting him to, you know, wanting him to be remembered because he died in '44.
Yeah.
But she also gave me some great sort of snippets of gossip as as well,
That's
which is great.
amazing. I would say
Sorry,
two
today-
more
today,
questions.
yeah.
One we have here.
Thank you.
Hello.
Thank you, Vanessa.
No,
A great
Nice to see you.
presentation.
Yeah.
Great to see you. So I've been looking at the, while you've been speaking, I've been sort of contemplating and meditating on the paintings. And you were talking about the frame
The
and
edge.
composition,
Yeah, the composition.
the edge.
Yeah.
So just in terms of the organisation of the paintings, what I've noticed is that there's like a pattern in all of them, which is when you talk about numbers.
Numbers.
So you have three
Yeah.
colours, three main colours up
Yeah.
on the ground,
Sometimes 4, sometimes 3. Yeah. Depending on the size.
including the ground, four including the ground. But I'm looking at like 3 yellow strips,
Yeah.
3 grey
Yeah. Yeah.
areas.
There is a system.
Yeah, exactly. So I love that, and I love how you're using this very simple system of 3,
Yeah.
more or less.
Yeah.
That's what I see in all of them. That's what I
Yeah.
can't see this one very well, but I think it's the same thing.
I think that's 4. That's 4. But I'm with you. Yeah.
Okay. Well, in that I see 3 as well. But what I see with this one and also with this one is like an inversion. So you have like the brown intersecting the green, and then above you have the green intersecting the brown, and then the red intersecting the purple, and then the purple intersecting the red. And you do sort of similar things, like with the yellow on the green, and then the green on the yellow, stuff like that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
can you talk a bit about the thinking behind
Okay.
this?
Well, first of all, you it's the thing I don't normally talk about, but well done. Of course, there's maths a little bit, not much, because I'm not very good at it. But I do have to divide them, because otherwise I wouldn't get the spaces in between equal. That's the point. Because if you look at, there's always what the spaces are that in between are they add up to the whole. So they're divided, by 8 or 9 or 5 or whatever it might be to get the width band, of each one. To every 2 straight lines, there has to be a curve. Well, this is my own, whatever. But there's a system, there's a kind of, we have systems, there's a little bit way back in the day when I realised that most formalist modernism was straight-edged. And my little moment of going, I'm going to break that one, I'm a woman, was the curve, I mean, I'm not saying that there aren't curves in other, in modernist men, but on the whole there's not, the straight line, straight line, straight. So the curve is always that thing about deviation. And then of course the other thing about it is that the other stricture of modernism, which I love, is that it's flat. That you read it like that, it's flat. And I really want to make things complicated. And it may not be the best thing to do, but I want to make things that are a bit difficult to look at, which is kind of an oxymoron, isn't it? You want people to be drawn in, but then you want to kind of poke them in the eyes a bit. You don't want to make it easy. Sometimes they are easy. The big ones are more like that. And the big ones are, I think when I was talking about it a bit before, about the 7-foot thing, they are the things I can inhabit, and I kind of sense that I can literally, as it were, physically move them around, like pick them up and go, The small ones, I think, being the tiny ones down there and the smaller ones, I think of being a bit more like looking, because they're not so kind of systems in a way, and I think about them as being more like looking at the world through the wrong end of the telescope, like it's over there. Whereas these, I actually sort of think I'm able to move around and shift them. And they're all made with a Russian palette knife, I forgot to say that.
Yeah, we didn't say, but yeah, this is something that we dwelled on before. Russian palette
Just
knife.
happened to find them once upon a time in Red Square.
Yeah.
Does that sort
That's
of-
great.
Thank you. Thank you for the question.
One last question.
I have 2 questions, but one's very quick. One's serious and one's fun. I got the impression from today's talk that cities are quite important to
Yeah.
you. You've been based in Bermondsey,
Yeah.
and you spoke of how New York was
Yeah.
really impactful.
Yeah.
Do you think your work would be, are you an artist who's always fed off living in a city and the energy of a city, or do you think if you'd lived or been based in a different environment, would your work be the same? Is
Well,
the work coming from an entirely
I was born.
Just in case,
Yeah.
for the benefit of
Yeah.
online, you asked whether it's important to have lived in cities
Yeah.
rather than the countryside
Yeah.
for your
And
family.
the answer is absolutely yes.
Yeah.
But the irony is that I'm a country girl. I was a tomboy. I used to dig holes.
Mm.
I was much happier climbing trees and digging holes than I was doing anything else.
Mm.
but the city, and there's a little bit in there, I think it's this bigger thing about the city. It's about actually even hearing that noise out there. It's about there's a generation of work going on. You're part of a working community.
The energy.
And I had a studio for a very short while near Greenwich Park. And it was so bloody quiet. It was lovely, pretty and everything, but it was too quiet. And actually there is something about that. Plus, it's about people, and it's about galleries, it's about going to see ballet, it's about going to the movies, it's about exhibitions, obviously. There's that house. And I do write a bit about it in there, because there are, when artists get quite successful, that's when they go and get their country studios. And I don't think I would. I mean, not that I am, so it's not a bit of a problem really. But it's that thing about wanting that energy that is to do with the city.
So the work is shaped by.
And yes, I think it is.
It's your own language, but it's also responding to the city.
I think it's urban. I think it is. I'm not saying that don't love the landscape, but all murmurations.
Yeah.
Don't get many of them in the city anymore. But yeah.
And then my second question was, did you get your motorbike?
No, I got the leather jacket, and it's a proper shot one, shot, proper. And I do still wear it, even though I think there's an age thing that we probably should stop wearing it. But
you could still get the motorbike.
And I've been on the motorbike. Yeah, I know. Not sure.
Vanessa, thank you so much.
That's my sister.
I think we all have.